This will be a fairly quick, it's a half-hour session. We are going to discuss and examine the epistolary tradition within literature and art more broadly through the prism of two specific examples. One that is fairly well-known, somewhat canonical in poet circles. I am a poet, by the way. My debut collection of poetry is called Elephant. I'll give you a little sneak peek of the mock-up cover. It's coming September of next year, and this is an Egon Schiele painting called Child in a Meadow with Halo. And I introduced that as just sort of a little bit of a bridge, as there always has been, between poetry and the visual arts. The two examples we will look at today are Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, a kind of seminal text, a long-standing correspondence between what was known even then in his day as a master of the language arts in Rainer Maria Rilke, and a poet who was just sort of beginning his career and had reached out to this exalted figure and been very vulnerable and just sort of asked for some kind of context or direction to the artistic life and life of a creative person that was coming. The other example we're going to look at is letters between Vincent van Gogh and his brother, who was named Theo van Gogh. And if you aren't aware, Theo and Vincent were very, very close. Vincent, of course, struggled with various mental illnesses throughout his life and was also an absolute genius of the creative arts. And Theo was in many ways a kind of standby for Vincent, but was also his art dealer, his promoter, person who really made sure that Vincent's name was etched as deeply into history as it has been. So I personally came to Letters to a Young Poet when I was myself probably 17 or 18 years old. And it's incredibly resonant for a young person, but I have found that it maintains that resonance to a peculiarly emphatic degree as I get older. So my first book is coming out next year, as I mentioned, and in all of these final edits that I've been doing and in sort of synthesizing a life's work into one Word document, I've been turning more and more to these letters. So I'm especially excited to discuss them today. And I have one example that I'm gonna share with you all. We're gonna read it together. I'm gonna share my screen and then talk about it a little bit. And then I hope we'll have time to jump over and discuss Van Gogh, both Theo and Vincent, a little bit, and what their correspondence meant to each of them in particular. I know that Vincent used to include sketches, little drawings of what would become paintings, and he would include them in his letters to his brother Theo. So in that case, the correspondence was a kind of sounding board within what is familiar, what is comfortable, what is safe, a relationship between siblings who care about each other deeply. That was a space in which Vincent very much felt safe to put forward ideas that were just days into their lives. Essentially, if you can picture a giraffe giving birth to a baby giraffe and the legs are wobbling, the baby giraffe is equivalent to these sketches that Vincent was sharing with his brother. So these are early forms of what would become spectacular paintings, but carry with them the seed of that artistic vulnerability that we all feel at the beginning of a creative endeavor. And every time you begin a new creative act, you're sort of starting from scratch in a way, or at least it feels that way. So to have someone to share that early work with is very valuable. But getting back to the letters, Rilke is a German poet, best known for a collection called Duino Elegies, which he wrote in a kind of fever dream, staring at the ocean late one night. He always referred to it as a poem that was spoken to him, that he simply transcribed. And that's a kind of different way of looking at art and artists than we have presently. We think of artists as the origin point of their art. And throughout history, there have been several different iterations of this philosophy. But if you would go back to, say, for instance, ancient Greece, the way that they would consider artists were, they would consider them to be channels through whom the art passes, rather than the maker of the art. It was someone who was porous to what would come through them from some other cosmic space, or from the world itself, or from a collective energy, or what have you. So we take on this great sort of responsibility, and with that comes this trope of the quote unquote tortured artist, who is so deeply responsible for everything they make. And that's something that we'll see a little bit in these letters from Rilke to this younger poet, and vice versa. But it's also interesting to think of artists as people who simply open doors, rather than people who are designing every bit of furniture within the room. So I'm going to share my screen here. If anyone has any questions or comments, please just throw those into the chat. We will get to them soon enough. And we will have room at the end to have a Q&A, and I want to hear from you all as well. So just to begin with, let's take a look at, we have an example of one of these letters. This is on the Penguin Random House website. And as you can see, the date is 1903, February 17th in Paris. So I'm just going to read this so that we can get the language in our minds. And as with any poet, when you are writing, the written word is something you almost compulsively take very seriously. If your medium is the written word, even in epistolary form, a letter to another person, you can't help but look at it as though it's a piece of art that you're making. It's as though a painter, instead of sending an email to a friend, painted them an email and snail mailed it or sent it digitally. There's almost no escaping the fact that you are working within your artistic medium, even though it's not necessarily thought of as art. As you can tell, these are letters that have been published and read as art and as correspondence. So they kind of live in both of those worlds. So you can read along with me, and I will read it aloud as well. And this is from Rilke to the younger poet who had asked for advice. Dear Sir, your letter arrived just a few days ago. I want to thank you for the great confidence you have placed in me. That is all I can do. I cannot discuss your verses, for any attempt at criticism would be foreign to me. Nothing touches a work of art so little as words of criticism. They always result in more or less fortunate misunderstandings. Things aren't all so tangible and sayable as people would usually have us believe. Most experiences are unsayable. They happen in a space that no word has ever entered, and more unsayable than all other things are works of art, those mysterious existences who life endures beside our own small, transitory life. Just as an aside, that saying the unsayable became, soon after this book, a very common definition of poetry, an attempt to say the unsayable. With this note as a preface, may I just tell you that your verses have no style of their own, although they do have silent and hidden beginnings or something personal. I feel this most clearly in the last poem, My Soul. There, something of your own is trying to become word and melody. And in the lovely poem To Leopardi, a kind of kinship with that great solitary figure does perhaps appear. Nevertheless, the poems are not yet anything in themselves, not yet anything independent, even the last one and the one to Leopardi. Your kind letter, which accompanied them, managed to make clear to me various faults that I felt in reading your verses, though I am not able to name them specifically. You ask whether your verses are any good. You ask me. You have asked others before this. You send them to magazines. It sounds familiar to all of us, right? You compare them with other poems, and you are upset when certain editors reject your work. Again, timeless to the artist. Now, since you have said you want my advice, I beg you to stop doing that sort of thing. No one can advise you or help you. No one. There is only one thing you should do. Go into yourself. Find out the reason that commands you to write. See whether it has spread its root into the very depths of your heart. Confess to yourself whether you would have to die if you were forbidden to write. This most of all, ask yourself in the most silent hour of your night, must I write? Dig into yourself for a deep answer. And in this answer rings out an assent. If you meet this solemn question with a strong, simple, I must, then build your life in accordance with this necessity. Your whole life, even into its humblest and most indifferent hour, must become a sign and witness to this impulse. So it's beautiful, right? When poets write letters, the language facilitates a deeper communication than for others who are perhaps not as familiar or experienced with representing their emotional feelings in language. But you can see that there is some sort of subjectivity offered. He's kind of dismissive of the poems that he actually receives, but he's dismissive in a greater effort to empower this younger poet who has written to him that they are the authority on their own work and on their own lives, because the success or failure of a given poem is whether or not it speaks truthfully to the inner life of that person who has written it. And so what Rilke in this letter, as you can see, is trying to do is to advise and encourage this younger artist, but really it could be any artist. This could be a letter that Rilke wrote to himself at the end of his life. This process of going into ourselves as an artist is a process that we can never perfect and that never ends, because the self that we are going into is always changing. And so we work on excavating the path to our own depths, but the destination we are trying to reach is constantly fluid and in motion, necessarily and thankfully, because life keeps moving and the world turns. It doesn't stay the same on its orbit. So this going into oneself is not only where you would go to find out whether or not your passion for the craft has integrity. It is where you go to make the art itself. It's the same place. That's what strikes me when I read this letter, is that's that deep interior, so to speak, where Rilke is advising this young poet to access their own deep interior in order to ask the question, must I create? Now, I personally find that a bit dramatic. I don't think you have to die for your art. I think I think the ancient Greeks would say you can relax a little bit. We want you to be able to go home at the end of the workday. So, but a lot of artists are that severe with themselves. And I certainly have been in the past as well. I try to meet my creative practice with a bit more gentleness nowadays, but it can often feel very severe as the need to expel whatever these feelings are that we project and manifest in a created piece of art. They come from us and we have a need to release them via the creative act. So I think that there's a kind of dual utility to this advice, that you can go into yourself to access your relationship to your art, and then to speak whatever it is that you make, to articulate into art what you feel. And this also reminds me very much of Rainer Maria Rilke's perhaps seminal poem is called The Torso of Apollo. And it's about the famous sculpture, I believe. I believe the statue is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy, and was made by David, I want to say. But the Torso of Apollo is the study of this sculpture. And in a sonnet, you have a volta in the final two lines, in which not only the rhythm and rhyme scheme of the poem, if it's a sonnet, is meant to change, but the content and semantics of the poem are meant to turn. Volta actually translates to turn. And the very ending of that poem, The Torso of Apollo, Rilke writes, "You must change your life." So the stakes were that high for him in looking at this beautiful, effervescent, deeply moving sculpture, a piece of art. Sometimes an artist will look at a piece of art and think, that's beautiful, or that makes me think. And sometimes an artist will look at a piece of art and think, I have to change my entire life, because there can be no greater fealty than between a person and what moves them, what makes them feel alive, what inspires them to different avenues of thought and eventually of action. So it sounds dramatic, but in a way, it can very much be factual. You know, we all have conversations in our lives sometimes that change our life. Events, you know, more familiar with, weddings, children, all these sorts of things, careers, you know, these things can change our lives, but sometimes it's a smaller detail. Sometimes it's a painting, sometimes it's a poem. So these letters carry with them such seriousness, and even the dismissiveness of this letter, in which he's saying your poems aren't very good because he's so severe. You know, he's kind of saying, well, your poems, I'm looking past your poems to you, because when you're an artist and you're starting out, what you make is not necessarily representative of what you want to make, because you have to learn to make what you want to make. And it's a practice. But
I just want to give a time update that we have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, sorry, I'm rambling on and on. This is the other thing I wanted to briefly share. Here you have a little something about Vincent van Gogh's letters to his brother, and how he calls the sketches that he includes scratches, which speaks to the kind of pain-pleasure dichotomy that we all experience when we're trying to say something that we feel is true. But with that, I want to open it up. If anyone has any comments or questions or reactions to what we've just read or thought about, I'd love to open that up, or else I can continue pontificating. Okay, it looks like we're good for now, but I will keep an eye on it. So just going to share one more time quickly so that you all can see what I'm looking at here again. You can see that the scratches and or sketches that Vincent van Gogh included in letters to his brother Theo were meant to give a kind of idea of what he was working on. That goes for Theo on the receiving end, but I believe that Vincent was also giving Vincent an idea of what Vincent was working on, because it's very different talking to yourself than it is talking to someone else. You have a different standard of accountability. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. But okay, let me take a quick. Oh yeah, okay, sorry, Teresa, let me share my screen one more time again. Make sure that we can all see that. So this is the little paragraph in which Vincent van Gogh refers to his sketches as scratches. Nowadays, we'd send a photo by WhatsApp or email. So this is on the Van Gogh Museum website. By the way, a wonderful museum in Amsterdam. There's a lot of beautiful, beautiful work by Van Gogh and other German and Austrian painters as well. But as you can see with the painting Field with Irises near Arles, Vincent was giving himself a sense not only of the structure and spatial elements of the painting, but the colors as well, which were very, as we know, electric in his imagination and in fact in his perception. So we can even take a look at the sketches, it looks like here. So if anyone is curious, these letters are online. It's a little more reading material. But I'm not sure if we can see the sketches there. So anyways, the idea of providing a safe space in which to do rigorous work, I think is shared in both this correspondence between Van Gogh and his brother Theo, and in the letters to a young poet that we read between Rainer Maria Rilke and a young poet who did not end up taking on the great canonical name recognition and significance that we each sort of think we want. But of course, the greater gift is just participating in these traditions and having some access to our own deep interiors. And that's something that lasts forever. And I would just say that's something that I would encourage all of us to wait until our hour of silence, whatever that means to each of us in our lives, and ask ourselves, do we have access to our own deep interior lives and senses of being? Because artist or not, that's something that we are going to need if we are to live an enriched life